On a cool autumn evening, the streets of Washington, D.C. were alive with the hum of activity. The air carried a slight chill, and leaves danced in the breeze as they fell from trees lining the quiet neighborhoods. It was one of those rare nights when Marcus Hayes, the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, decided to step away from his demanding schedule for just a few hours. Known for his sharp mind, calm demeanor, and leadership skills, Hayes had spent decades navigating some of the most complex challenges facing the United States. But tonight he wasn't thinking about classified briefings or global threats. He simply wanted to unwind. Marcus had always been someone who valued balance in life. Despite holding one of the highest positions in one of the world's most secretive organizations, he made it a point to carve out moments for himself whenever possible. That evening, he met up with old friends at a cozy jazz club tucked away in a corner of the city. The music flowed effortlessly, filling the dimly lit room with soulful melodies that seemed to transport everyone there to another time. For a while, Marcus forgot about work entirely, letting the rhythm of the saxophone and piano wash over him. As the night wore on, Marcus said his goodbyes and stepped outside into the crisp air. He climbed into his sleek luxury sedan, a car that reflected not only his success, but also his appreciation for craftsmanship and design. As he drove through the deserted streets, the city felt unusually peaceful. The roads were empty, save for an occasional passerby or distant headlights flickering in the darkness. It was during these quiet drives that Marcus often found clarity, his thoughts drifting between personal reflections and professional responsibilities. But peace is fragile, especially in a world where appearances can sometimes outweigh reality. Just as Marcus turned onto a main road, red and blue lights flashed behind him. His heart sank slightly, not because he feared anything illegal, but because he knew what this could mean. Pulling over to the side of the road, he took a deep breath and steadied himself. He had done nothing wrong. His speedometer hadn't even nudged above the limit. Still, experience told him that being pulled over as a black man in America often came with complications unrelated to actual traffic violations. The two police cruisers that surrounded his car added to the tension. Their presence felt overwhelming, almost suffocating. Two officers emerged from their vehicles, their body language exuding authority and something else: suspicion. One officer approached the driver's side window, while the other lingered near the back of the car, his hand resting casually on his holster. The scene was familiar, yet unsettling. Marcus rolled down his window, meeting the gaze of the officer standing beside him. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone clipped and dismissive. There was no warmth in his voice, no acknowledgement of basic courtesy. Instead, there was an immediate assumption of guilt, as if Marcus had already committed some invisible crime. This wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered such behavior, but each instance left a mark. He reached calmly into his glove compartment, retrieving the requested documents without hesitation. Every movement was deliberate, careful, years of training kicking in to ensure he avoided escalating the situation unnecessarily. What struck Marcus most was the look in the officer's eyes. It wasn't curiosity or concern. It was judgment. They weren't seeing a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. They weren't seeing a respected leader whose decisions impacted national security on a daily basis. No, all they saw was a black man driving a luxury car late at night. To them, that combination must have seemed suspicious enough to warrant scrutiny. And so, the interrogation began. Not just about the supposed reason for the stop, but about Marcus himself. One officer glanced at the license plate, then back at Marcus. "This your car?" he asked, skepticism dripping from every word. Before Marcus could respond, the second officer chimed in, leaning against the hood of the vehicle. "Looks pretty fancy for someone like you," he remarked, his tone laced with mockery. "Where'd you get the money for this? You sure it's not stolen?" Each question stung, not because they were particularly clever or insightful, but because they revealed a deeper truth. These men had already made up their minds about him. In their eyes, Marcus wasn't a citizen deserving of respect or fairness. He was a stereotype, a caricature built on prejudice and fear. Yet, despite the sting of their words, Marcus maintained his composure. He understood the importance of staying calm, of choosing his battles wisely. Reacting emotionally would only give them more ammunition, more justification for their actions. As the minutes ticked by, the absurdity of the situation became harder to ignore. Here was a man responsible for safeguarding the nation's secrets, sitting quietly while two strangers questioned his very existence. It was a surreal moment, one that highlighted the stark contrasts in how people are treated based solely on the color of their skin. For Marcus, it was a reminder of the work still needed to bridge divides and challenge assumptions. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that reason would eventually prevail. Little did anyone know, this encounter was about to take a dramatic turn. What started as a routine traffic stop would soon spiral into something far greater, exposing truths that couldn't be ignored and forcing accountability where it was desperately needed. The two officers stood beside Marcus Hayes's car, their postures rigid and their expressions hardened. One of them, Officer Daniels, leaned closer to the driver's window, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as it flicked over Marcus's face and then down to the documents he had handed over. The other officer, Officer Grayson, lingered near the rear bumper, occasionally glancing toward the luxury sedan with a mix of suspicion and disdain. Their behavior was unmistakable. They weren't just conducting a routine traffic stop. This was something else entirely. Officer Daniels studied Marcus's license and registration, squinting at the small print as though searching for any excuse to find fault. Marcus Hayes, he muttered under his breath, rolling the name around in his mouth like it didn't quite fit. Then, without looking up, he added, "What kind of name is that?" His tone carried an edge, a subtle jab meant to unsettle. But Marcus didn't flinch. He sat still, his hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the scene unfold with quiet resolve. Grayson chimed in from behind the car, his voice louder and more mocking. "You sure this is your ride?" he asked, tapping the sleek metal of the sedan with his baton. "Looks a little fancy for someone like you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Someone like you. It wasn't just a question about ownership. It was a challenge to Marcus's identity, his worth, his right to exist in this space. To these officers, Marcus wasn't a man who had earned success through hard work and dedication. He was merely a stereotype, an image conjured by their own biases. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Years of experience in high-pressure situations had taught him the value of patience. He knew better than to let frustration or anger dictate his actions. Instead, he kept his focus steady, meeting Officer Daniels' gaze when necessary, but avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Still, the weight of their words pressed down on him. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it. The casual cruelty, the dismissive tone, the thinly veiled hostility. These were tools designed to intimidate, to strip away dignity, and replace it with doubt. Daniels flipped through the papers again, pausing briefly before turning his attention back to Marcus. "So where'd you get the cash for this thing?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the car. "You don't exactly look like the type who can afford something like this." Again, the implication was clear. Black men driving expensive cars must have questionable sources of income. The assumption stung, not because it was surprising. Marcus had encountered such attitudes countless times before, but because it revealed how deeply ingrained these prejudices were. Even here, in one of the most powerful cities in the world, people couldn't see past the color of his skin. Grayson laughed, a sharp bark that echoed in the otherwise silent night. "Maybe it's stolen," he suggested, leaning casually against the trunk of the car. "Or maybe it's tied to something shady, you know what I mean?" The comment was delivered with a smirk, as if he found humor in the absurdity of his own accusation. But there was no humor for Marcus. Each word felt like another brick being laid in a wall meant to confine him, to define him by stereotypes rather than facts. Despite the mounting tension, Marcus remained calm. He knew that reacting, emotionally, would only play into their narrative, giving them ammunition to justify their actions. So instead he chose silence, not out of fear but out of strategy. Silence could be powerful too, especially when faced with ignorance. By refusing to engage in their game, Marcus forced them to confront the emptiness of their accusations. They had nothing concrete to go on, no evidence of wrongdoing, yet they persisted in their line of questioning, hoping to provoke a reaction. As the minutes dragged on, the officers grew bolder in their insinuations. Daniels began rifling through the glove compartment, claiming he was checking for anything suspicious. Meanwhile, Grayson circled the car, peering into the windows and inspecting the interior with exaggerated scrutiny. Every movement, every comment was calculated to make Marcus feel small, to remind him of his supposed place in their skewed hierarchy. Yet none of it worked. Marcus's composure never wavered, even as their disrespect became increasingly blatant. What made the situation all the more surreal was the stark contrast between reality and perception. To these officers, Marcus was just another black man driving an expensive car late at night, a potential criminal until proven otherwise. They had no idea that the man sitting quietly in front of them held one of the highest-ranking positions in the U.S. government. They didn't know that his decisions influenced national security policies, that his expertise was sought after by presidents and diplomats alike. All they saw was a target, someone they could assert dominance over without consequence. And yet, despite their attempts to belittle him, Marcus understood something they did not. Power isn't always visible. True strength lies not in force or intimidation, but in resilience and integrity. While the officers continued their charade, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, Marcus maintained his poise. He knew that the truth would eventually come to light, and when it did, the tables would turn in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. For now, though, the ordeal dragged on. The officers' questions grew more pointed, their tone more aggressive. They demanded explanations for things that required none, scrutinizing every detail of Marcus's life as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't exist. And through it all, Marcus stayed silent, letting their words hang in the air like smoke, harmless unless fanned into flames. Unbeknownst to the officers, help was already on the way. Marcus's decision to activate the emergency protocol on his phone had set off a chain reaction within the CIA's operations center. Analysts monitoring global threats had flagged the unusual activity involving their deputy director, and reinforcements were mobilized immediately. But neither Marcus nor the officers knew this yet. For the moment, the standoff continued, each side playing their part in a drama that would soon capture the nation's attention. As the tension mounted, one thing became abundantly clear. This encounter was about far more than a simple traffic stop. It was a reflection of broader societal issues, a microcosm of the systemic racism that plagued law enforcement and beyond. To Marcus, it was personal, but it was also universal. And while the outcome remained uncertain, one truth stood firm. Justice, though delayed, would not be denied. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. Marcus Hayes sat patiently in his car, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, as the two officers continued their relentless interrogation. Officer Daniels stood at the driver's side window, flipping through Marcus's documents with exaggerated slowness, while Officer Grayson circled the vehicle like a predator sizing up its prey. Their behavior was calculated, each word, each movement meant to unsettle and intimidate. But Marcus had faced far worse challenges in his life, and he wasn't about to let these men break him. Despite their attempts to provoke a reaction, Marcus remained calm. His silence was deliberate, a shield against their hostility. He knew that responding emotionally would only give them more ammunition, fueling their assumptions and escalating the situation further. Instead, he focused on staying composed, channeling the same discipline that had helped him navigate countless high-stakes scenarios throughout his career. Yet, even for someone as seasoned as Marcus, patience had its limits. The absurdity of the situation gnawed at him, The endless questions, the thinly veiled accusations, the blatant disregard for basic respect. Officer Daniels finally looked up from the papers, his face twisted into a smirk. "You know," he said, leaning closer to the window, "people don't usually drive cars like this without some connections." The pause before the last word was deliberate, laced with insinuation. "What do you do for work, anyway? Some kind of entrepreneur?" The way he emphasized the word made it sound less like a compliment and more like an accusation. Marcus took a slow breath before answering. "I work for the government," he replied evenly, his voice steady and measured. It was a simple statement, designed to diffuse the situation rather than escalate it. But instead of calming the officers, his response seemed to irritate them further. "The government?" Officer Grayson scoffed, stopping mid-circle to peer through the passenger side window. "Doing what? Paperwork? You don't look like the bureaucratic type." Marcus didn't rise to the bait. He simply nodded slightly, choosing not to elaborate. Explaining his role as deputy director of the CIA would likely fall on deaf ears, or worse, invite more ridicule. These men weren't interested in facts. They were operating on stereotypes and preconceived notions. To them, Marcus was just another black man driving a luxury car late at night, a walking contradiction to their narrow worldview. Anything he said would be filtered through that lens, twisted to fit their narrative. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable but undeniably smug. They seemed to take perverse pleasure in prolonging the stop, dragging out the humiliation as if it were some kind of game. Daniels tapped the license plate again, shaking his head theatrically. "Still doesn't explain how you can afford something like this," he muttered, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Most people working 9-to-5 jobs don't roll around in cars worth 6 figures. Grayson chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "Maybe he won the lottery," he quipped, earning a smirk from Daniels. "Or maybe there's something else going on here." Marcus clenched his jaw briefly, then forced himself to relax. He reminded himself that reacting wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make them see him differently or acknowledge the unfairness of their treatment. What mattered now was getting through this moment with his dignity intact. Still, it was hard not to feel frustrated. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, being treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin and the car he drove. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the standoff dragged on, Marcus decided it was time to take matters into his own hands, not through confrontation, but through subtle action. Reaching carefully into his pocket, he discreetly activated the emergency protocol feature on his phone. Designed specifically for situations where CIA personnel might find themselves in danger or detained unnecessarily, the feature sent an immediate alert to the agency's operations center. Within seconds, analysts monitoring global threats would realize that something unusual was happening involving one of their top officials. Unbeknownst to the officers, reinforcements were already on the way. But Marcus couldn't afford to wait idly. He needed to keep the situation under control until help arrived. So when Daniels demanded that he step out of the car for a pat-down, Marcus complied without hesitation. He opened the door slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unhurried, ensuring there was no reason for the officers to misinterpret his actions. As he stepped onto the pavement, the cool night air brushed against his skin, a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere surrounding him. Daniels moved closer, his body language aggressive as he began frisking Marcus. "Empty your pockets," he ordered gruffly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus did as instructed, pulling out his wallet, keys, and phone, placing them neatly on the hood of the car. Each item was scrutinized with exaggerated care, as though the officers expected to find contraband hidden among the mundane belongings. When nothing incriminating turned up, their frustration became palpable. "You're clean," Daniels admitted, reluctantly, tossing the items back onto the hood. "But we're still running your plates, just sit tight." "Sit tight." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of the phrase. He had been sitting tight for nearly 20 minutes now, enduring baseless accusations and invasive questioning, all because of the color of his skin. If anything, the phrase only highlighted the power imbalance at play. These men could detain him indefinitely, subjecting him to their scrutiny without consequence, while he had little choice but to comply. Just as the thought crossed his mind, distant sirens pierced the night air. At first the sound was faint, barely noticeable over the hum of the city. But within moments it grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights reflecting off nearby buildings. Both officers froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the commotion. A convoy of unmarked black SUVs screeched to a halt behind their patrol cars, blocking the road entirely. Doors opened simultaneously and a group of sharply dressed men and women emerged, badges gleaming under the streetlights. Agent Lisa Monroe, head of internal affairs at the CIA, led the charge. Her presence commanded attention, her sharp eyes scanning the scene with precision. She strode directly toward the officers, her expression unreadable but undeniably authoritative. "Do you have any idea who you've detained?" she asked sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The officers stared at her, dumbfounded, their earlier bravado evaporating instantly. Before they could respond, Marcus stepped forward, his posture calm but commanding. "I'm Marcus Hayes," he announced, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The officers' faces paled as the weight of their mistake sank in. They had pulled over and harassed one of the highest-ranking officials in U.S. national security. The realization hit them like a freight train, shattering their false bravado and replacing it with sheer panic. As Agent Monroe began issuing orders, directing her team to secure the area and document the incident, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. This wasn't the first time he had encountered racism, nor would it be the last. But tonight, justice would prevail, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. The fight was far from over, but for now, Marcus felt a small sense of vindication. Sometimes truth and accountability came in unexpected ways, and tonight they arrived in the form of flashing lights and federal agents. The arrival of the unmarked black SUVs transformed the scene in an instant. What had been a tense and deeply personal confrontation between Marcus Hayes and the two officers now became something much larger, a spectacle that drew gasps from anyone watching. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet street, casting long shadows across the pavement and reflecting off the sleek surfaces of Marcus's luxury sedan. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Officer Daniels and Officer Grayson stood rooted to their spots, their earlier arrogance replaced by wide-eyed shock as they realized they were no longer in control. Agent Lisa Monroe wasted no time taking charge. She moved with purpose, her sharp heels clicking against the asphalt as she approached the group. Her demeanor was calm but commanding, exuding the kind of authority that made people instinctively step aside. Behind her, a team of agents fanned out, securing the area and observing every detail with precision. They carried themselves with military-like discipline, their movements synchronized and deliberate. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like an ordinary law enforcement operation, but this wasn't ordinary. This was the Central Intelligence Agency stepping onto the scene, ready to protect one of its own. "Do you have any idea who you've detained?" Agent Monroe asked again, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Her tone was icy, devoid of emotion, yet dripping with disdain for the ignorance displayed by the two officers. She didn't wait for them to respond. Instead, she turned slightly, gesturing for Marcus to join her at the center of the unfolding drama. Marcus stepped forward, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. Gone was the quiet man who had endured insults and baseless accusations just moments ago. In his place stood Deputy Director Marcus Hayes, a figure of immense power and influence. He straightened his shoulders, meeting the eyes of the officers, not with anger but with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. "I'm Marcus Hayes," he said clearly, his voice steady and resonant. "Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency." The words landed like a thunderclap. Officer Daniels blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to form a response but failing utterly. Officer Grayson stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Their bravado evaporated completely, replaced by sheer panic. The realization of what they had done, and more importantly, who they had done it to, hit them like a freight train. These weren't just idle threats or empty posturing anymore. They were standing face to face with one of the most powerful men in U.S. national security. For a beat, there was silence, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a catastrophic mistake. Then, chaos erupted. Both officers began stammering excuses, their voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to justify their actions. We didn't know," Daniels blurted out, his hands raised defensively. "It was just a routine stop. We thought—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Thought what? That Marcus was involved in criminal activity simply because of the color of his skin? That his expensive car somehow made him suspicious?" None of those thoughts could be spoken aloud now, not when faced with the glaring truth of their bias. Grayson chimed in next, his voice trembling. "Sir, we're sorry. We didn't mean any disrespect. It's just protocol. We check everyone, equally." But even as he spoke, his words rang hollow. Everyone present knew better. Protocol hadn't dictated the mocking tone, the invasive questions, or the thinly veiled accusations about Marcus's income and possessions. No, this had been something far uglier. Racism cloaked in the guise of policing. Agent Monroe listened to their rambling apologies with a cold detachment. When they finally ran out of words, she fixed them with a piercing stare. "Let me make one thing crystal clear," she said, her voice low, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You've just harassed one of the highest-ranking officials in the United States government. Whatever protocol you claim to follow doesn't excuse your behavior tonight. You will be held accountable." Her declaration sent a shiver down the spines of both officers. They glanced at each other, their faces pale and stricken. For the first time, they understood the gravity of their actions. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. It was a public relations nightmare waiting to happen. And worse, it was a stark reminder of the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. Their reckless assumptions had put them directly in the crosshairs of federal scrutiny. Meanwhile, Marcus watched the scene unfold with a mixture of emotions. Relief washed over him, knowing that justice would finally prevail in this instance. Yet, beneath that relief, simmered frustration and sadness. He couldn't help but think of all the others who had been subjected to similar treatment but lacked the resources or connections to fight back. How many black men and women had been pulled over, humiliated, and dismissed without ever receiving vindication? How many stories like his ended not with accountability, but with tragedy? As the agents began documenting the incident, taking statements, snapping photos, and collecting evidence, the two officers were escorted to the sidelines. They stood there, visibly shaken, as their patrol cars were surrounded by federal vehicles. The contrast was striking. The sleek, polished SUVs representing the pinnacle of governmental authority versus the standard-issue cruisers symbolizing local law enforcement. It was a visual metaphor for the power imbalance that had just been exposed. Word of the incident spread quickly. Neighbors who had been drawn to their windows by the commotion whispered among themselves, piecing together fragments of what they saw. Some recorded videos on their phones, capturing the surreal sight of federal agents descending upon a routine traffic stop. Social media lit up almost instantly, with hashtags trending nationwide as people speculated about the identity of the man at the center of the controversy. Who was this mysterious figure whose mere presence had summoned the CIA to a quiet D.C. neighborhood in the middle of the night? Back at the scene, Agent Monroe addressed Marcus privately, her tone softening slightly. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, genuine concern etched on her face. "This shouldn't have happened to you or to anyone." Marcus nodded, appreciating her sentiment but unwilling to dwell on his own experience. "I'll be fine," he replied. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been treated unfairly because of their race. We need to use this moment to spark change." Agent Monroe nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of his words. This incident wasn't just a personal affront, it was a symptom of a much larger problem. By bringing attention to it, Marcus hoped to shine a light on the injustices that persisted within law enforcement and society at large. If handled correctly, this could become a catalyst for reform, a turning point in the ongoing struggle for equality. As the night wore on, the situation continued to evolve. The officers were formally placed under investigation, their badges confiscated pending further review. Meanwhile, Marcus was free to leave, though he chose to stay behind to ensure the documentation process was thorough. He wanted nothing left to chance. Every detail of the encounter needed to be recorded so that the truth could speak for itself. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the street had returned to its usual quiet state. The SUVs had departed, leaving only faint tire marks as evidence of the dramatic events that had unfolded. Officer Daniels and Officer Grayson sat slumped in their patrol car, their careers hanging precariously in the balance. And Marcus Hayes drove away, his mind already turning toward the future. This chapter of his life was far from over. It was only beginning. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity, both for Marcus Hayes and the nation at large. News of the traffic stop spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts, eyewitness accounts, and official statements from the CIA. What had started as a routine evening quickly escalated into a national conversation about race, power, and accountability within law enforcement. For Marcus, this wasn't just a personal ordeal. It was an opportunity to address systemic issues that had plagued society for generations. Within hours of the incident, footage began surfacing online. Neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation captured shaky videos on their phones, showing the two officers circling Marcus's car, their body language aggressive and dismissive. The clips painted a vivid picture: a black man sitting calmly in his luxury sedan, while two white officers questioned him with thinly veiled hostility. The juxtaposition between Marcus's composed demeanor and the officers' escalating aggression struck a chord with viewers across the country. Comments poured in expressing outrage, disbelief, and solidarity. Hashtags like "God or Justice for Marcus Hayes" and "You End Racial Profiling" trended worldwide, amplifying calls for reform. Meanwhile, the two officers, Officer Daniels and Officer Grayson, found themselves at the center of a media storm. Their names were released to the public after an internal investigation confirmed they had violated departmental policies during the stop. Initial reports revealed that they had no prior record of disciplinary action, which only deepened the frustration among critics. How could two individuals with seemingly clean records exhibit such blatant prejudice? It was a question that resonated far beyond this single incident, highlighting the insidious nature of implicit bias within law enforcement. Backlash came swiftly. Protesters gathered outside the local police precinct, holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Black Lives Matter." Community leaders called for immediate action, demanding transparency and justice. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the officers' behavior, framing it as yet another example of systemic racism. Even politicians weighed in, using the incident to push for legislative changes aimed at addressing racial profiling and misconduct in policing. For Marcus, the attention was overwhelming but necessary. As deputy director of the CIA, he was accustomed to operating behind the scenes, away from the public eye. But this time, he knew he couldn't stay silent. The weight of his position gave him a platform few others possessed, and he felt a profound responsibility to use it wisely. After consulting with colleagues and trusted advisors, Marcus decided to address the nation directly, not as a victim, but as an advocate for change. Standing before reporters outside CIA headquarters, Marcus delivered a speech that would be remembered for years to come. Flanked by fellow agency officials and civil rights advocates, he spoke with clarity and conviction, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "What happened to me that night is not unique," he began, pausing briefly to let his words sink in. "It is part of a pattern that has persisted for far too long. It is a pattern rooted in fear, ignorance, and prejudice. And it is a pattern that must end." His remarks resonated deeply, striking a chord with millions of Americans. who had experienced similar injustices. He recounted the details of the traffic stop without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. He described how the officers questioned his identity, mocked his name, and insinuated that his success was somehow illegitimate, all because of the color of his skin. Yet throughout his account, Marcus maintained a tone of measured calm, refusing to let anger overshadow his message. "This isn't about revenge or retribution," he emphasized. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I endured simply because of who they are. This isn't just my story. It's everyone's story. Every black person, every person of color, deserves to live without fear of being judged by stereotypes rather than character." The crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement or wiping away tears. When Marcus concluded his remarks, applause erupted spontaneously, echoing through the streets surrounding the building. Reporters rushed forward, eager to ask questions, but Marcus held up a hand to signal he was finished. His message had been delivered, and there was nothing more to say, at least for now. Behind the scenes, efforts to hold the officers accountable gained momentum. Both Daniels and Grayson were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of a full investigation. Internal affairs teams pored over evidence, including dashcam footage, witness testimonies, and the documentation collected by federal agents during the scene. Early findings suggested that the officers had acted outside the bounds of acceptable conduct, raising the possibility of criminal charges. Legal experts debated whether the case could set a precedent for prosecuting instances of racial profiling, a development that would have far-reaching implications. In addition to legal proceedings, the incident prompted broader discussions about training and oversight within law enforcement. Experts argued that current protocols often failed to address implicit biases, leaving officers ill-equipped to interact with diverse communities. Calls for mandatory anti-racism training, independent review boards, and stricter accountability measures grew louder, with public pressure mounting on lawmakers to act. At the same time, Marcus became a symbol of resilience and hope. People from all walks of life reached out to share their stories, thanking him for speaking out and inspiring them to do the same. Schoolchildren wrote letters praising his courage, while activists hailed him as a leader in the fight for equality. Despite the adulation, Marcus remained humble, reminding everyone that the work was far from over. "This is not about me," he told those who praised him. "It's about creating a future where everyone can thrive, regardless of their race or background." As weeks turned into months, tangible progress began to emerge. The Department of Justice launched a nationwide initiative to combat racial profiling, partnering with community organizations to develop new strategies for fostering trust between law enforcement and marginalized groups. Local police departments implemented reforms, including updated training programs and increased transparency in disciplinary actions. While skeptics cautioned against viewing these steps as solutions to deeply entrenched problems, many saw them as meaningful first steps toward lasting change. For Marcus, the experience reinforced his belief in the power of perseverance. He returned to his duties at the CIA, carrying with him the lessons learned from that fateful night. Though he wished he had never been pulled over under such circumstances, he recognized that the incident had sparked something greater, a movement, driven by ordinary people demanding extraordinary change. And though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, Marcus held on to hope that one day, true equality might prevail, not just in theory, but in practice. The journey was far from over, but thanks to voices like his, the path forward seemed a little clearer.